The old farmhouse stood like a picture from a storybook against the October sky. Built way back in 1923, it had white wooden walls and a red roof that had seen almost 70 years of rain, snow, and sunshine. The house belonged to Robert and Helen, a kind elderly couple who had lived there for most of their married life. It was Friday evening in 1994, and their 8-year-old granddaughter Katie was coming to visit for the weekend. This had become a special tradition that happened once every month. Katie's parents would drive her out to the farmhouse, and she would spend 2 wonderful days with her grandparents before going back home. The farmhouse was surrounded by 40 acres of beautiful land. Tall oak trees stood like guards around the property, their leaves turning bright red and golden yellow in the autumn weather. When the wind blew, the leaves would dance and fall like nature's confetti. Katie loved running through those fallen leaves, making big piles to jump into. When Katie's parents dropped her off that Friday evening, everything seemed perfectly normal. Her mother gave her an extra tight hug and reminded her to be good for her grandparents. Her father ruffled her hair and told her he would see her on Sunday evening. Neither parent could have imagined that this would be the last time they would see their daughter for many, many years. Robert was a gentleman with kind eyes and rough hands from years of working on the farm. He had retired from his job at the local factory 5 years earlier, but he still kept busy taking care of the property. Helen was a warm woman who made the best apple pie in the whole county. She had a garden where she grew vegetables and flowers, and she always smelled like cinnamon and vanilla from all her baking. Saturday morning came with bright sunshine and cool air. Katie woke up in the little guest room that Helen had decorated, just for her visits. The walls were painted soft pink, and there were pictures of farm animals hanging up. The bed had a quilt that Helen had made herself, with patches of different colored fabric sewn together like a rainbow. The 3 of them spent the morning walking around the property. Robert showed Katie how the apple trees were heavy with fruit, ready for picking. They filled 2 big baskets with red and green apples. Some were for eating right away, and others would be stored in the basement for winter. Helen explained how they had been growing apples on this land for decades, and how each tree had its own personality and flavor. After lunch, Robert decided to teach Katie something new. He brought out his old pocket knife and a piece of soft wood. Sitting on the front porch in their rocking chairs, he showed her how to whittle. This is the art of carving wood into different shapes using a knife. Robert had learned this skill from his own grandfather when he was just a boy. Katie was fascinated as Robert's experienced hands slowly carved the wood. Tiny shavings fell onto the porch floor as a small wooden bird began to take shape. He explained how you had to be patient and careful, never rushing the process. Each cut had to be thought about before making it, because once you cut the wood, you could not put it back. While Robert and Katie worked on their whittling project, Helen was busy in the kitchen preparing her famous apple pie. She used apples from their own trees, mixing them with cinnamon, sugar, and a secret ingredient that she had never told anyone about. The smell of the baking pie filled the whole house with a wonderful aroma that made everyone hungry. As the afternoon turned into evening, the 3 of them sat on the porch enjoying the peaceful quiet of the countryside. You could hear birds singing in the trees and the distant sound of a tractor working in a field somewhere far away. There were no city noises here, no traffic or honking horns, just the gentle sounds of nature. A neighbor who lived about half a mile away later remembered seeing smoke coming from the farmhouse chimney that evening around 8 o'clock. This was completely normal for October weather, as people often lit fires to keep their homes warm during the cool autumn nights. Nothing seemed unusual or wrong. The family had made plans to attend church together the next morning. Helen had already picked out Katie's dress for Sunday service, and Robert had polished his good shoes. They were planning to sit in their usual pew, the 3rd row from the front on the right side where the Carter family had sat for over 30 years. As bedtime approached, Helen helped Katie get ready for sleep. They brushed her teeth together in the old-fashioned bathroom with its black and white checkered floor. Helen read Katie a story from a book of fairy tales, using different voices for all the characters. Katie giggled at Helen's funny voice for the Wicked Witch and her gentle voice for the princess. Robert made his usual rounds before bed, checking that all the doors were locked and the windows were secure. He turned off the lights one by one and made sure the fire in the fireplace was burning safely behind the screen. This was his nightly routine that he had followed for years without fail. The house settled into peaceful sleep around 10:30 that night. Katie was dreaming about the wooden bird that Robert had carved for her. Helen was sleeping soundly next to Robert in their bedroom on the first floor. Robert was a light sleeper, but even he was resting well after the active day they had spent together. But at 3:47 in the morning, everything changed forever. A truck driver was making his late-night delivery run along the country road that passed by the Carter property. His name was Bill, and he had been driving this route for almost 15 years. He knew every curve and hill along the way. As he rounded the bend near the farmhouse, something caught his eye that made his heart skip a beat. Orange and red flames were shooting up from the old white house. The fire was already huge, much bigger than any normal fireplace or burning pile of leaves. Bill immediately pulled his truck over to the side of the road and grabbed his radio to call for emergency help. The nearest fire department was in the town of Millbrook, about 12 miles away. When Bill's call came through to the dispatcher, she immediately sent out the alarm to all available firefighters. But in a small town like Millbrook, the fire department was made up of volunteers who had to leave their homes in the middle of the night and drive to the fire station before they could even begin to help. By the time the first fire truck arrived at the scene, the house was completely covered in flames. The fire was so intense and hot that the firefighters could not get close enough to enter the building. The autumn had been very dry, with little rain for several weeks. The old wooden house, built almost 70 years earlier, burned like a giant matchstick. Strong winds that night made the situation even worse. The flames spread quickly from room to room, eating up everything in their path. The heat was so fierce that windows exploded outward, sending glass flying in all directions. The metal roof began to buckle and twist from the extreme temperature. Fire. Chief Johnson, who had been fighting fires for over 20 years, later said it was one of the most intense house fires he had ever seen. The flames were so hot that they had to keep the fire trucks much further back than usual. Even wearing their protective gear, the firefighters could barely stand the heat radiating from the burning building. For 6 long hours, the brave firefighters worked to control the fire. They pumped water from a nearby pond, but it seemed like the flames just kept growing stronger. Finally, as the sun began to rise on Sunday morning, the fire began to weaken. What had once been a beautiful old farmhouse was now just a pile of smoking black remains. When the fire was finally cool enough for investigators to enter, they began the sad task of searching through what was left. In what had been Robert and Helen's bedroom, they found the remains of the elderly couple. The intense heat had destroyed most everything, but there was enough evidence to confirm that both grandparents had died in the fire. But then came the mystery that would puzzle investigators for the next 18 years. Despite searching through every single piece of debris, they could not find any trace of 8-year-old Katie. Not a piece of clothing, not a toy, not even the smallest bone fragment that would prove she had been in the house when the fire started. Investigators brought in special equipment to sift through all the ashes and debris. They searched the basement, which had partially survived the fire. They searched the area where Katie's bedroom had been. They even searched the yard around the house, thinking maybe she had tried to escape but had been overcome by smoke. But Katie had simply vanished without a trace. Fire investigation expert Dr. Wilson came from the state capitol to examine the scene. She had studied hundreds of house fires and had never seen anything like this. Even in the most severe fires, she explained, human remains almost always leave some evidence behind. Teeth are especially resistant to fire, and metal objects like belt buckles, jewelry, or shoe eyelets usually survive even extreme heat. The complete absence of any trace of Katie made no scientific sense. It was as if she had never been in the house at all, even though her parents had definitely dropped her off 2 days earlier. Katie's parents arrived at the scene early Sunday morning after police officers came to their house with the terrible news. Her mother collapsed when she saw the destroyed farmhouse where her daughter should have been sleeping safely. Her father stood in shocked silence, unable to understand how his little girl could just disappear. The official report listed Katie as a presumed victim of the house fire, but many people in the small community began to whisper about what might have really happened. Some wondered if she had somehow escaped and was wandering lost in the woods. Others thought maybe she had never been in the house when the fire started. Search parties formed immediately. Hundreds of volunteers from the town and surrounding areas spent weeks combing through the 40 acres of property and the woods beyond. They looked under every fallen log, behind every large rock, and in every possible hiding place where a scared little girl might have gone. But no trace of Katie was ever found. Detective Frank Romano had been solving cases for 23 years, but nothing had prepared him for what he found at the Carter farmhouse. As he stood in the still smoking ruins on that Sunday morning, his experienced eyes told him something was very wrong with this whole situation. Frank was not the kind of man who believed in ghost stories or impossible things. He was practical, logical, and thorough. Every mystery had an answer if you looked hard enough and asked the right questions. But standing there looking at the complete destruction of the old farmhouse, he felt confused for the first time in his career. The fire department had done their job well. They had put out the flames and made the area safe for investigation. Now it was Frank's turn to figure out exactly what had happened during those terrible early morning hours. He put on his work gloves and began the careful process of examining every piece of evidence. The first thing Frank needed to determine was how the fire had started. Working with the fire department's expert investigator, they traced the burn patterns through the destroyed house. Fire leaves clues, like a map showing where it started and which direction it traveled. By studying the damage, experts can usually tell you exactly where the first flame began. After several hours of careful examination, they determined that the fire had started in the kitchen. The burn patterns showed that the flames had begun near the stove area and then spread outward. From there, this was not unusual. Kitchen fires were actually quite common, especially in older homes where people might forget to turn off a burner or leave a pot unattended. But Frank knew that Robert and Helen Carter were very careful people. Their neighbors described them as the type of folks who checked and double-checked everything. Helen always made sure the stove was turned off before going to bed. Robert walked through the house every night, making sure everything was safe and secure. Even more puzzling was the fact that the house had brand new smoke detectors. Helen had insisted on installing them just 6 months earlier, after reading about a house fire in the next town over. These smoke detectors were the best money could buy, with fresh batteries that had been tested just the week before the fire. So why hadn't the smoke detectors woken everyone up in time to escape? Frank found the remains of the smoke detectors in the debris. The plastic cases had melted, but the electronic parts inside were still intact enough to examine. What he discovered made the mystery even deeper. The smoke detectors had been working perfectly. In fact, they had been going off for quite some time before the fire reached them. This meant that the loud, piercing alarm had been sounding throughout the house for several minutes, maybe even longer. Robert and Helen should have heard it easily. They should have had plenty of time to wake up, grab Katie, and get out of the house safely. But they hadn't moved from their bed. Frank began to interview everyone who had known the Carter family. He talked to neighbors, friends from church, the mailman, and even the grocery store clerk who knew them by name. Everyone told him the same thing. Robert and Helen were wonderful people who loved their granddaughter more than anything in the world. The neighbors who lived closest to the farmhouse were the Johnson family. They lived about half a mile away through the woods. Mrs. Johnson told Frank that she had seen the Carter's car in the driveway when she went to get her mail on Saturday afternoon. Everything had looked normal and peaceful. Mr. Johnson mentioned that he had smelled smoke around 8 o'clock Saturday evening, but this didn't worry him. Many people in the area burned wood in their fireplaces during October, and the Carters always kept a nice fire going in their living room when the weather turned cool. Frank also spoke with Reverend Williams from the Methodist Church where the Carter family attended services every Sunday. The Reverend said that Robert and Helen had been looking forward to bringing Katie to church that morning. Helen had even volunteered to help serve coffee and cookies after the service. But as Frank dug deeper into the family's background, he began to discover some troubling information that nobody had mentioned before. First, he learned that Robert and Helen had been having serious money problems. Robert's pension from the factory was much smaller than they had expected. The cost of maintaining the old farmhouse and the 40 acres of property was becoming too expensive for them to handle. Frank found unpaid bills stuffed in a drawer in what remained of their bedroom. Electric bills, property tax notices, and repair estimates that showed the couple owed much more money than they had. They had been talking about selling the farmhouse, but Helen couldn't bear the thought of leaving the place where she had lived for most of her adult life. The second discovery was even more concerning. Frank obtained Helen's medical records and learned that she had been diagnosed with early-stage dementia 6 months before the fire. This was a disease that affects memory and thinking. Helen had been having trouble remembering things and sometimes got confused about what day it was or where she had put things. The family had kept this diagnosis secret. Even their closest friends didn't know about Helen's condition. Katie's parents knew, but they had agreed to keep the information private to protect Helen's dignity and feelings. Frank wondered if Helen's memory problems might have played a role in the fire. Maybe she had forgotten to turn off the stove. Maybe she had been confused and unable to respond properly when the smoke detectors started going off. But this still didn't explain what had happened to Katie. Frank obtained the phone records for the Carter house from the weeks leading up to the fire. What he found there opened up entirely new questions about what had really happened that night. In the 2 weeks before the fire, Helen had made several phone calls to a law office in Detroit, about 200 miles away. When Frank contacted the law office, he spoke with attorney James Henley, who confirmed that Helen had been asking questions about legal guardianship and adoption procedures. This was very strange. Why would Helen Carter be interested in adoption and guardianship laws? Katie already had parents who loved her and took good care of her. There was no reason why the grandparents would need to become her legal guardians. Even more mysterious were several calls to a private investigator named Tony Stone, who worked in Detroit. When Frank tried to contact Stone, the private investigator refused to talk. He claimed that his conversations with Helen Carter were protected by attorney-client privilege, even though she was no longer alive. Frank pressed harder, explaining that this was a case involving a missing child and a double homicide. But Stone stood firm. He said he had made promises to Helen Carter that he intended to keep, even after her death. Whatever Helen had hired him to do, it was going to remain a secret. This refusal to cooperate made Frank very suspicious. What kind of work had Helen hired a private investigator to do? What secrets had she been keeping from her family and friends? Frank decided to dig deeper into the Carter family history. He spent hours at the county courthouse looking through old records and documents. He contacted relatives who lived in other states. He even tracked down people who had worked with Robert at the factory years earlier. What he discovered painted a picture of a family that was much more complicated than anyone had realized. Helen Carter had been married once before she met Robert. Her first husband had died in a car accident when Helen was only 22 years old. She had been pregnant at the time, but had lost the baby due to the shock and stress of her husband's death. This tragedy had affected Helen deeply. Several people told Frank that Helen had always regretted not being able to have children of her own. When Robert's daughter married and had Katie, Helen had poured all of her maternal love into her granddaughter. But Frank also learned that Helen had been acting strangely in the months before the fire. She had been asking odd questions about family history and legal matters. She had been unusually interested in Katie's birth certificate and other official documents. The local pharmacist mentioned that Helen had been picking up prescriptions for anxiety medication that she had never needed before. Her doctor confirmed that Helen had been having trouble sleeping and had been worried about something, but she had never explained what was bothering her. Frank began to develop a theory about what might have happened. He thought that Helen's dementia might have caused her to become confused about Katie's safety or well-being. Maybe she had convinced herself that Katie was in some kind of danger and needed to be protected. But this theory still had huge holes in it. Even if Helen had been confused or worried, how could an 8-year-old child completely disappear from a house fire without leaving any trace at all? Frank brought in additional experts to examine the scene. He hired an anthropologist who specialized in studying human remains after fires. He consulted with other fire investigators from across the state. He even brought in a team with special metal detectors to search for any tiny pieces of evidence that might have been missed. But no matter how hard they looked or how many experts they consulted, the result was always the same. Katie had simply vanished without leaving a single trace of evidence that she had ever been in the house when the fire started. The case began to attract attention from news reporters and television shows about unsolved mysteries. People from all over the country called the police department with theories and suggestions. Psychics offered to help find Katie. Other families, who had lost children in house fires, wanted to compare stories. But none of these outside offers of help produced any useful information. The mystery remained as puzzling as ever. As weeks turned into months, Frank continued to work on the case. Even though his supervisors wanted him to focus on other investigations, he couldn't let go of the feeling that he was missing something important, some crucial piece of evidence that would finally make sense of everything. The case file grew thicker and thicker as Frank documented every interview, every piece of evidence, and every theory he had considered. But Katie remained missing, and the questions remained unanswered. Frank knew that somewhere out there was the truth about what had really happened on that October night in 1994. He was determined to find it, no matter how long it took. The years after the fire were the darkest time in Linda Mitchell's life. Every morning she woke up hoping that this would be the day someone would call with news about Katie. Every evening she went to bed knowing that another day had passed without answers. Linda was Katie's mother, and losing her daughter changed everything about who she was as a person. Before the fire, she had been a cheerful woman who loved to laugh and spend time with friends. She worked as a teacher at the local elementary school and was known for her bright smile and endless patience with children. But after Katie disappeared, Linda became a different person entirely. She quit her teaching job because being around children reminded her too much of her missing daughter. She stopped going to social events and gradually lost touch with most of her friends. The only thing that mattered to her anymore was finding Katie. David, Katie's father, tried his best to support his wife through the terrible grief, but he was struggling with his own pain. He was a practical man who worked as an electrician, and he believed that sometimes bad things just happened for no reason. After 2 years of searching with no results, David began to accept that Katie was probably gone forever. But Linda could not accept this. She refused to believe that her daughter was dead, even though the police had officially closed the case. Something deep in her heart told her that Katie was still alive somewhere, waiting to be found. The difference in how they handled their grief slowly tore David and Linda apart. David wanted to try to rebuild their lives and maybe even have another child. Linda wanted to spend every spare moment and every extra dollar searching for Katie. They began to argue about money, time, and what was healthy versus what was destructive. 3 years after the fire, David and Linda divorced. It wasn't because they stopped loving each other, but because their pain had made them into two completely different people who could no longer understand each other. David moved to California, where he eventually remarried and started a new family. Linda stayed in Michigan, determined to never give up looking for her daughter. Detective Frank Romano had officially retired in 2008, but the Katie Mitchell case haunted him even in retirement. He had worked hundreds of cases during his career, but this was the only one he had never been able to solve. In his home office, he kept copies of all the case files in 3 thick binders that he would review periodically. Frank had developed several theories over the years about what might have happened to Katie. His most believable theory was that somehow Katie had escaped from the house before or during the early stages of the fire. Maybe she had been outside using the bathroom, or maybe she had woken up and run outside when she smelled smoke. But if Katie had escaped the fire, why hadn't she come home? Frank thought that maybe she had been injured and confused. An 8-year-old child who was scared and possibly hurt might not know how to find help. Maybe she had wandered into the woods and gotten lost. Another possibility was that someone had found Katie after she escaped, but for some unknown reason, that person had never contacted the police. Maybe it was someone who couldn't have children of their own and made a split-second decision to keep Katie as their own daughter. Maybe it was someone who was afraid of getting involved with the police for personal reasons. Frank had even considered the possibility that Katie's disappearance was planned somehow. The phone calls that Helen Carter had made to the lawyer and private investigator still bothered him. What if Helen had arranged for Katie to be taken somewhere safe before the fire started? But this theory had problems too, because both grandparents had died in the fire. Every year on the anniversary of the fire, local newspapers would run a story about the unsolved case. Sometimes this would generate new tips and phone calls, but none of them ever led anywhere useful. Frank would follow up on every single tip, no matter how unlikely it seemed. In 2004, a woman who claimed to be psychic called the police station, saying she had visions of Katie living happily with a family in another state. She said Katie was now a teenager who didn't remember her real identity, but was doing well in school and had friends. Frank was skeptical of psychics, but he was desperate enough to meet with her anyway. The woman couldn't provide any specific details that could be verified, so her information was useless. Linda Mitchell, meanwhile, had become an expert on missing children cases. She studied everything she could find about how children disappear and how families can search for them. She learned about age progression technology, which uses computers to show what a missing child might look like as they get older. Linda worked with specialists to create pictures showing what Katie might look like at age 10, 12, 15, and 18. She printed thousands of these pictures and distributed them at shopping centers, schools, and community events. She posted them online and sent them to police departments across the country. She also maintained a website called Finding Katie, where she shared information about the case and asked for help from anyone who might have seen her daughter. The website got messages from people all over the world offering support and encouragement, but no solid leads about Katie's whereabouts. In 2009, Linda's hopes were raised higher than they had been in years when a young woman in Oregon contacted her, claiming to be Katie. The woman, who was about the right age, said she had always felt like she didn't belong with her family and had memories of living on a farm with grandparents. Linda was so excited that she flew to Oregon immediately to meet this young woman. But when they met in person, Linda knew right away that this wasn't her daughter. The woman looked nothing like Katie, and her memories were too vague and generic. A DNA test confirmed that this was just another case of mistaken identity or wishful thinking. These false hopes were almost worse than having no hope at all. Each time Linda thought she might have found Katie, only to be disappointed, it felt like losing her daughter all over again. Tony Stone, the private investigator that Helen Carter had hired before her death, had moved his business from Detroit to Florida in 2003. He was now in his 60s and had been thinking about retirement, but he still carried the weight of the secret that Helen Carter had shared with him 18 years earlier. Stone had always been a man who took his professional responsibilities seriously. When clients hired him to do work, he promised them complete confidentiality. Even when those clients died, he felt obligated to keep their secrets. But as the years passed, Stone began to wonder if his silence was causing more harm than good. He had read newspaper articles about Linda Mitchell's endless search for her daughter. He had seen the pain in her face in television interviews where she begged for any information about Katie. Stone knew that he had information that could end Linda's suffering, but he had made a promise to Helen Carter that he felt bound to keep. Sometimes, Stone would pick up the phone to call the police and tell them what he knew. But each time, he would remember Helen's desperate face when she had begged him to never reveal her secret. She had trusted him with something so important that she was willing to pay a large amount of money to keep it hidden. In 2010, Detective Lisa Chen took over Frank Romano's old position and decided to take another look at some of the unsolved cases from previous years. The Katie Mitchell case immediately caught her attention because of how strange and unexplained it was. Chen brought fresh eyes to the investigation and decided to approach it from a different angle. Instead of focusing on what had happened at the farmhouse, she began looking at similar cases from other parts of the state. She wondered if Katie's disappearance might be connected to other crimes that had happened around the same time. Chen found 3 other house fires that had occurred in neighboring counties within 6 months of the Carter fire. In 2 of these fires, families had died, but there were also some unusual circumstances that didn't quite make sense. However, after months of investigation, Chen couldn't find any solid connections between these cases and Katie's disappearance. The investigation was suspended once again due to lack of new evidence, but Chen kept the case file on her desk as a reminder that some mysteries were still waiting to be solved. Meanwhile, Linda Mitchell continued her tireless search. She had now been looking for Katie for 16 years, and the search had consumed her entire life. She had spent all of her savings on private investigators, age progression photos, and travel expenses to follow up on tips. She lived in a small apartment and worked part-time jobs to pay for her basic needs, but every extra dollar went toward finding Katie. Linda's health had suffered from years of stress and worry. She had developed high blood pressure and had trouble sleeping. Her hair had turned completely gray and she had lost a lot of weight. Friends and family members worried about her and tried to convince her to get counseling or to accept that Katie might never be found. But Linda couldn't stop searching. She felt that giving up on Katie would be like losing her daughter a second time. Even if it took the rest of her life, she was determined to learn the truth about what had happened on that terrible October night in 1994. As 2011 turned into 2012, Linda marked another anniversary of Katie's disappearance. 18 years had passed since the fire, and Katie would now be 26 years old if she was still alive. Linda updated her website with new age-progressed photos and continued to hope that somewhere, someone would recognize her daughter and finally bring her home. March 2012 started like any other month for Tommy Chen, who worked at his family's auto salvage yard in Detroit. The business had been in his family for over 30 years, and Tommy had grown up among the rows of damaged cars and trucks that people brought in when they needed parts or wanted to get rid of vehicles that were too expensive to repair. Tommy was 28 years old and had been working full-time at the salvage yard since he graduated from high school. He knew everything. There was to know about taking apart cars and finding the valuable parts that could be sold to repair shops and individual customers. It was honest work, and it helped people save money when their cars broke down. On a cloudy Tuesday morning in March, an older gentleman drove up to the salvage yard pulling a trailer with a badly damaged car on it. The car was a 1993 Honda Civic that had been severely burned in a barn fire. The paint was completely gone, the windows were melted, and the interior was destroyed. Most people would have looked at it and seen nothing but worthless scrap metal. But Tommy had learned from his father that even the most damaged cars sometimes contained valuable parts. The engine block might still be good, or the transmission could be salvaged. Sometimes there were expensive catalytic converters or other parts that could be cleaned up and resold. The man who brought in the Honda seemed nervous and eager to get rid of it quickly. He explained that the car had been sitting in his barn for years after a fire had damaged both the barn and the vehicle. He was finally cleaning out his property and wanted to get some cash for the scrap metal. Tommy paid the man a fair price for the Honda and had it moved to the section of the yard where he processed heavily damaged vehicles. He planned to strip it down over the next few days and see what parts might be worth saving. The next morning, Tommy began the process of taking apart the burned Honda. He started with the easy parts, removing the wheels, taking out what was left of the seats, and disconnecting the battery cables. The fire damage was extensive, but Tommy had worked on fire-damaged cars before. As he worked deeper into the car's interior, Tommy noticed something unusual. When he tried to remove what was left of the dashboard, he found that there was something wedged behind it in a space that wasn't normally accessible. Using a crowbar, he carefully pried apart the melted plastic and metal. What he found hidden in that small space changed everything. It was a small metal box, about the size of a large book. The box was made of heavy steel and had obviously been designed to protect important documents from fire and water damage. The box was locked, but the intense heat from the fire had warped the metal enough that Tommy was able to force it open with some effort. Inside the fireproof box, Tommy discovered several items that made his heart start beating faster. There was a birth certificate for Katie Ann Mitchell, dated 1986. There was a handwritten letter that looked like it had been written by an elderly woman. And most shocking of all, there were legal adoption papers that had never been officially filed with any court. Tommy's hands were shaking as he read the letter. It was dated just 3 days before the fire that had killed Robert and Helen Carter. The letter was written by Helen Carter herself, and it revealed a secret that had been hidden for 18 long years. The letter began with Helen explaining that she was writing it as insurance, in case something went wrong with a plan she had made to protect her granddaughter Katie. Helen wrote that she loved Katie more than her own life, but she had discovered something that made her believe Katie would be better off living with someone else. Helen had learned that David Mitchell, the man who had raised Katie as his daughter, was not actually Katie's biological father. Linda Mitchell had confided this secret to her mother during a tearful conversation several months before the fire. Linda had explained that Katie was the result of a brief relationship she had during a time when she and David had temporarily separated early in their marriage. David had never been told the truth, and Linda lived in constant fear that he would somehow discover that Katie wasn't his biological child. She was terrified that if David learned the truth, he would leave both her and Katie, destroying their family. Helen's letter explained that she had hired private investigator Tony Stone to locate Katie's real biological father. Stone had tracked down a man named Thomas Ryan, who lived in Toronto, Canada. Ryan was now married to a woman named Carol, and they had been trying to have children for several years without success. When Helen contacted Thomas Ryan and explained the situation, he was shocked to learn that he had a daughter he had never known about. Helen told him that she believed Katie would have a better life with him and his wife, away from the complicated family situation in Michigan. The plan that Helen had developed was elaborate and desperate. She had arranged for Thomas Ryan to drive down from Toronto on the night of October 15, 1994. He was supposed to meet them at the farmhouse and take Katie back to Canada with him, where she would live as his adopted daughter. But Helen knew that if Katie just disappeared, there would be a massive police investigation that might eventually uncover the truth. So she had decided to stage Katie's death in a house fire that she planned to start deliberately. The letter explained that Helen had intended to start a small, controlled fire in the kitchen that would give Thomas Ryan enough time to get Katie safely away from the house. Then Helen and Robert would escape through their bedroom window, and everyone would assume that Katie had died in the fire. But something had gone terribly wrong with Helen's plan. According to the letter, Helen had taken some of her anxiety medication to calm her nerves before starting the fire, but she had accidentally taken too much of the medicine, which made her drowsy and confused. When she lit the fire in the kitchen, it spread much faster than she had expected. By the time Helen realized that the fire was out of control, it was too late. The flames had already blocked the path to their bedroom door, and the smoke was too thick for her and Robert to escape through the window. Helen wrote that her last conscious thought was hoping that Thomas Ryan had gotten Katie to safety before the house became completely engulfed in flames. Tommy sat in his salvage yard office staring at these documents and trying to understand what they meant. If Helen Carter's letter was true, then Katie Mitchell had not died in the fire 18 years ago. She had been taken to Canada by her biological father and had been living there ever since, completely unaware that her mother, Linda, had been searching for her all these years. Tommy knew he had to contact the police immediately. He called the Detroit Police Department and asked to speak to someone about a cold case from 1994. After being transferred several times, he finally reached Detective Lisa Chen, who had been working on the Katie Mitchell case. When Tommy explained what he had found, Detective Chen could hardly believe what she was hearing. She drove to the salvage yard immediately and examined the documents herself. Everything appeared to be authentic, including the handwriting analysis that would later confirm that Helen Carter had indeed written the letter. Detective Chen knew that the next step was to track down Thomas Ryan in Toronto. She contacted the UA, Canadian police, and requested their assistance in locating him. Within 2 days, they had found Thomas Ryan, now 52 years old, living in a suburb of Toronto with his wife Carol and their adopted daughter. When Canadian police officers knocked on Thomas Ryan's door, he took one look at their serious faces and knew that the secret he had been carrying for 18 years was finally about to come out. He broke down crying before they even asked him any questions. Thomas Ryan confessed everything. He told the police that he had driven to Michigan on the night of October 15, 1994, planning to meet Helen Carter and take Katie back to Canada with him. When he arrived at the farmhouse, he could see that there was already a fire starting in the kitchen. Helen Carter met him at the door with Katie, who was still in her pajamas and confused about what was happening. Helen thrust a small bag of Katie's belongings into Thomas's hands and told him to take the child and leave immediately. She said the fire was spreading faster than she had planned, and there wasn't much time. Thomas Ryan carried Katie to his car and drove away from the farmhouse as quickly as possible. By the time they reached the main road, they could see flames shooting up from the roof of the house behind them. Katie was crying and asking what was happening to her grandparents. But Thomas didn't know what to tell her. Instead of taking Katie directly to Canada, Thomas had driven to a friend's cabin in northern Michigan, where they stayed for several days while he tried to figure out what to do. He listened to news reports about the fire and learned that both grandparents had died and that Katie was presumed dead as well. Thomas realized that if he came forward with Katie at that point, he would probably be charged with kidnapping and other serious crimes. He also believed that Helen Carter had wanted Katie to live with him, and that going back would only cause more pain for everyone involved. So Thomas made the decision to take Katie to Canada and raise her as his own daughter. He and his wife Carol told everyone that they had finally been able to adopt a child through a private arrangement. Katie was so young and traumatized that within a few months, she began to think of Thomas and Carol as her real parents. They changed her name to Katie Ryan and enrolled her in school in Toronto. As the years passed, Katie's memories of her life before the fire became vague and dreamlike. Thomas and Carol told her that her previous parents and grandparents had died in a car accident, and she accepted this explanation without question. Katie grew up to be a happy, successful young woman. She was now 26 years old, working as a nurse in Toronto, and engaged to be married to a wonderful man she had met in college. She had no idea that her biological mother Linda had spent the last 18 years searching for her and hoping for her return. When Detective Chen contacted Linda Mitchell with the news that Katie had been found alive, Linda collapsed from shock and joy. After 18 years of not knowing whether her daughter was dead or alive, she was finally going to be reunited with the child she had never stopped loving. But the reunion was complicated and emotional for everyone involved. Katie was overwhelmed to learn that the life she had believed was real was actually built on a lie. She was happy to meet her biological mother, but she also felt loyal to the man and woman who had raised her and given her a good life. Thomas Ryan was arrested and charged with kidnapping, but Katie's testimony about her happy childhood influenced the court's decision. She told the judge that Thomas and Carol Ryan had been loving parents who had given her every opportunity to succeed in life. The judge sentenced Thomas to probation and community service rather than prison time. The case was finally closed after 18 years, but it left everyone involved with complicated feelings about justice, family, and the unexpected ways that desperate decisions can change many lives forever. Linda Mitchell had her daughter back, but they were essentially strangers who had to learn how to be a family again. Katie had gained a mother she had thought was dead, but she had also learned that everything she believed about her past was a lie. The truth had finally been revealed, but it brought as many questions as answers about what makes a family and whether good intentions can justify terrible choices.